Alfred Wainwright made the hills of the Lake District accessible to tens of thousands of tourists. While they've been coming here, he's been going somewhere else.
This is a very sentimental journey for me, a reminder of the years after the war, when for about 30 years I used to come regularly in May and September, getting on the train at Oxenholme and heading north. I want to introduce you to Scotland. In the time of there, well, we haven't time to do everything I'd like you to see, but I'll try to pick out the highlights, the places that I like best.
Wainwright at 80. A.W., as he's affectionately known to his tiny circle of friends, is Britain's best-known man of the fells. He's become an unlikely hero to generations of fell walkers. His unique, beautifully detailed handwritten guides have been a passport to the high places of English Lakeland and the Pennines and Limestone country for generations of weekend explorers. Alfred Wainwright, the shy author of these guides, spent all his working life in local government. For 20 years he was Borough Treasurer of Kendal in Westmoreland. But away from the office, every moment of spare time was spent drawing and writing. Every precious day's holiday, every weekend, was spent in solitary exploration of the hills. These guides to the Lakeland Fells have now sold over 1 million copies, made their author a national institution, and for the past quarter of a century have kept a small-town printing press permanently in work. But every year, for the past 40 years, A.W. has turned his back on his beloved Lakeland. His destination has always been the same: Scotland, a new, altogether grander world to explore. In the Lake District, there are only 4 mountains over 3,000 feet. Here in Scotland, there are nearly 300. His love affair with this landscape was recorded in 1,000 or more black and white photographs. Later, these were to be the raw material for more than 400 Scottish mountain drawings. 40 years on, Wainwright wanted to recreate those journeys, to take a final look at the places he's admired so much. It was to be a nostalgic summer, a journey that would take us from the Coolin of Skye to the Cairngorms, from Kintail to Glencoe, a journey that for me would be an introduction to Shieldaig and Sandwood, the Five Sisters and the Giants of Torridon, a journey that began in the wind and the sea spray of the most remote corner of mainland Scotland. We began our travels together in Sutherland, a land of rock and legend. There was a chill in the April breeze as we arrived in the far north and began to explore this unique landscape, a place that's lived in A.W.'s memory for nearly a quarter of a century.
The landscape is different, strangely lunar. The coastline is tortuously indented and spattered with islands. The hinterland, a crazy labyrinth of 1,000 lochans from which rise gaunt and bare hills, splashed grey where the bedrock of gneiss breaks the surface. The loneliness is absolute. The silence can be felt. Here is a solitude, a sanctuary like no other. A wilderness that has qualities of fascination rather than beauty. When you are away from it, it calls.
no habitations at all, completely wild and desolate. I just don't understand why people go to Spain. Of all the trouble of passports and currency problems and dieting problems and foreign food and alien languages, they could come here. It's yours, it is, to enjoy.
Public transport had made it possible for Wainwright to visit and enjoy all but a few places on the Scottish mainland. But one notable location had eluded him in all these years. He'd never quite made it to Cape Wrath. The short journey from Durness to the peninsula is a chancy business in a hired boat and a rattling tourist bus. This time, though, tide and weather cooperated, and we made it.
Like it better to look at than to walk over, actually. Won't be easy walking over here. Further along the northern coast at Dunnet Head, which is near John O'Groats, that's just a bit nearer the North Pole. But we're looking straight at the North Pole from here. And we're looking at the Atlantic, which has waged a war against this headland ever since the land was formed, and never made any impression on it at all.
I suppose this must be quite a gentle sea compared to what it can be in
Yes.
winter gales.
Oh, yes, I'm sure it is.
There's not much froth today.
No, there isn't. The locals call it Wrath. Cape Wrath, as it's spelt. Can we go a bit further?
Not too much further. It's a nasty slope from now on. So, it's taken you 80 odd years to get here.
Yes, it has, yeah.
Worth the trek?
I'm glad I've seen it, yeah. Always wondered what it was like, and it's very much as I thought. Perhaps more impressive, actually. It's quite tremendous, isn't it? Now, the lighthouse itself was built in 1827. It was built by a relative of Robert Louis Stevenson. At one time, the families of the lighthouse men lived in the adjacent buildings, but now they're brought over by helicopter.
Strong walkers, and strong walkers only, can follow the coast southwards from Cape Wrath. There is a special reward, however, for those who suffer the rigours of this journey when the cliffs end suddenly to reveal ahead an inviting and welcome crescent of golden sands curving around a lovely bay. This is Sandwood Bay. Sandwood Bay is a haven of peace in a hostile environment, a jewel in a thorny crown. Its reputation as the most beautiful bay on the west coast of Scotland has developed in recent years, not fostered by press and media publicity, but by the enthusiastic recommendations of those who have been there. It is remote from roads and habitations and can be reached overland only on foot. Where the cliffs resume at the south end of the bay, a remarkable pillar of rock, Amborichli, the herdsman, rises vertically from the sea in isolation. This, to ordinary mortals, seems quite inaccessible, but has been climbed, the first ascent being in 1967.
We were heading south, aiming to spend the night at the fishing port of Kinlochbervie. But every mile and every headland brought a reason for delay.
This is All Shore Moor Bay, and it's 2 miles from Kinlochbervie. This is a beautiful bay, and it's one of a dozen around the coast of Sutherland.
On your early visits here, A.W., did you sort of dip in and out and do a mountain and a couple of bays? How did you used to do it?
As far as I could, but I'd always to have regard to the bus timetable. I'd got to get back to a bus, because there wouldn't be another one for 24 hours. So I was never able to venture far until I acquired a wife who could drive a car and had one, and brought it as a dowry. Since then, of course, we've been able to get it almost anywhere. And although the appeal of Sutherland to me is its mountains and its interior, there's no doubt about it that the coast is equally delightful. You've got a bay there with not a soul on it, completely deserted, almost unknown, but as beautiful a bay as you'll find anywhere.
Wainwright has always been torn between the delights of coast and mountain. The next day we turned inland into the long shadow of the hills. We were retracing A.W.'s journey into a mountain wilderness that had been the inspiration for those meticulous, vibrant pen and ink drawings.
The slender ribbon of road is the only line of communication, and it threads a winding course through unforgettable scenery. The foothills giving place to mountains no less striking, mountains that leap from the watery desert in stark array, mountains with glittering quartzite bonnets, mountains that can be approached only with navigational care. These mountains are not of tall stature by Highland standards, but have great individual distinction. All this is Sutherland, the southland of the Viking invaders. Scenically, it is the most remarkable area of Scotland, the remotest and the least inhabited. Geologically, the most interesting. Romantically, the most haunting.
In the 40s and the 50s, a trip this far north was a rare adventure. Tourism wasn't the staple industry of northern Scotland in those days. The early visitors were something of a curiosity with the locals. When Wainwright first came this way, there was scarcely any accommodation, certainly no tourist facilities. The roads, like the landscape itself, seem to have changed little since the days of the Highland clearances.
This was a main road north. Of course, they've all been vastly improved now, but and even in this state, they were classified as A roads. This was the A road, the main road north.
When you were travelling along roads like this, were there many people about?
No, very few cars. The longest walk I ever did was from Ullapool to Lochin, about 26 miles. On the old roads all the way. never saw a car, never saw another person. Amazing.
What happened when the weather turned on you?
I had to carry on until I could find accommodation.
But bad weather and bad roads weren't the only obstacles to Wainwright's travels. Here at Kileskew is one of the places where the sea pushes far inland, a natural barrier that for centuries made the far north a fearsome, secret place. Until recently, the only method of continuing the journey north was the ferry. When the wave of tourists came, there were queues and delays.
Now, whereabouts do you prefer to sit?
But A.W. has never been a man to be rushed. While the trippers grumbled, he would sit here for contented hours in the glow of a summer sunset.
Then you come down...
I sit on here.
Can you go over there?
Yeah.
Grand.
Now, this is a slipway of the old Kileskew ferry. And I always considered this the most romantic place along the west coast of Scotland. It's coming in from the sea, Loch Cairnbone, and it provided a barrier that road traffic couldn't negotiate. It interrupted the road journey north and penetrated so far inland into a range of high mountains that it couldn't be circumvented. The only way was a ferry here. Everything depended on the ferry. This was the key to the north of Scotland, coming from the south. The ferry now is gone. It's been superseded by the bridge. Can't say I like the bridge. It saves hours of the journey, but there's no magic about it. There was magic about the ferry boat. But it's sad to see an old servant cast aside, isn't it? I rather regret it because I spent hours here waiting for the ferry and not regretting a moment of it. The scenery is so superb around here. But we're looking at a scene here that hasn't changed for thousands of years. It's like looking at a dead world, but a very attractive dead world. There's no sense of death here, full of life. The best sound is silence, and here you get it. Just interrupted by a few seabirds. I think this is delightful. How does this compare with the city streets of London?
Sutherland is the most sparsely populated part of Britain, an infertile, inhospitable land, a land carved by ice and weather, a country where even A.W. needed a guide. We found one in the person of Dr. Penny,